2. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today. Boy, are things popping today. In the second hour, we will be talking about the Hunter Biden verdict. What does that mean? And what does it mean when we see him through the prism of sympathy and empathy? I think that we should. We should. There are so many people who've been traumatized as he's been traumatized, having lost his mother and his sister in an accident in which he and his brother were present. And you've got to feel for him for that. Having lost a brother who he loved dearly, a blood tie that he had to their mother. Absolutely. But there's so many people in the country who are similarly traumatized. And, we're all traumatized by something or another. And one of the things that I hope that we'll tap into is this these feelings that we have for Hunter Biden, maybe because he's the president's son and they're part of our national family. Hopefully we'll have that for everybody who's coursing through the system. Think about that, everybody. But his father's also at the center of mass incarceration of Black people. Indeed, there's a Black Republican representative who said there are many Black people in prison today, prison for years, because of the charges uh, of which he was found guilty. So let's talk about that in the second hour. But we've got a couple of other hot topics to talk about. Of course, we are going into the 2024 convention. Jim Narakis of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, I guess it was a Freudian slip because everybody keeps saying that it's going to be like 1968, but we're going to be talking with Professor Stevens Eunice, world-renowned professor from the University of San Francisco. He wrote a compelling piece in which he said Biden needs to learn the lessons of 1968, and he's not so sure that he has. But let's start with Jim Narakis, my dear, dear friend and brother beloved, who is, of course, part of the family here. On Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, they do such fine work. Fair.org. They need your support because they really are our eyes and ears in media. Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Indeed, you are responsible, Jim Narakis, for correcting my tongue and my thinking. I kept calling it the mainstream media. You said no. It is the corporate media. And as I said, that many in the audience started referring to the media as the corporate media, which reshapes your thinking. You get very clear on their agenda. And so, welcome back to the show, Jim Narakis.
Great to be back.
Well, let's talk about what happened with Justice Alito, Justice John Roberts, and Mrs. Martha Alito. They were at a dinner, the Supreme Court Historical Society, and you can buy tickets and go, and you get a chance to hobnob with Washington's power players, uh, uh, chief of whom are the justices from the Supreme Court. And so there is a liberal activist, Lauren Windsor, who went, but she disguised herself, not physically, but philosophically. And she pretended to be someone who was conservative. She is not. She is a progressive, or at least a liberal activist. And she was interviewing. Well, she was having a conversation, but it was really an interview. And so she recorded Justice Alito, Justice Roberts, and Mrs. Alito. And it was very, very interesting. And I have a lot of questions for you, Jim Narakis. But first, unpack this. What actually happened?
Well, she, as you say, she came up to Alito and had a brief conversation with him that she was secretly recording, which apparently is legal in that state. And she had actually talked to him before a year ago, and was sort of continuing a conversation that they had about whether it's possible to have a country that is not as polarized as we have now. And she was, in her conservative guise, was expressing pessimism about this. And Alito said to her, "I think you're probably right. One side or the other is going to win. I don't know. I mean, there can be a way of working, a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised. They really can't be compromised. And when she said that there's people who believe in that people that believe in God have to keep fighting to return our country to a place of godliness, Alito said, "I agree with you. I agree with you." These are kind of startling opinions from a Supreme Court justice who is supposed to be impartially making judgments on the core legal issues facing our country. And he is obviously taking one side of that position and saying that it's not really possible for both sides to coexist, which is a disturbing thing to hear from a Supreme Court justice. And interestingly, she at the same dinner she talked to John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who had a quite different and I would say a more normal response, which was to say that polarization is something that the country has always had, has dealt with in the past, and the implication is that we're gonna deal with it again. And when she tried the godliness line on him and the
pushback,
the Christian nation thing, he was like, I don't know that we're really a Christian nation. A lot of my Jewish and Muslim friends would disagree with that, and was saying that it was not the Supreme Court's role to to push the country in a moral decision, but to be basically an umpire on on the legal rules, and that it was up to legislatures to if there's any moral direction needed, that's where it should come from.
Jim, should we be this surprised by the forwardness of Justice Alito's opinions? I mean, this is someone who really stepped out the box, you recall, several years ago at a State of the Union address. And as the president was speaking, he mouthed, "That's not true."
Yeah, it's he's got a peculiar kind of attitude for a judge, I have to say. This is not what one, when you go to central casting and ask them to send you a judge type, this is not who you're expecting to get. This is a person who sees himself as a culture warrior.
Mm-hmm.
And he has been in trouble in the press recently for one thing, taking gigantic, I would call them bribes. He would refer to them as gifts from people, who have an interest in matters before the court. Taking just millions of dollars worth of freebies in a way that most people would say, most judges would be like, no, I can't do that because that would compromise my position. But from his point of view, evidently it doesn't trouble him. He's happy to take the largesse. He's also was in trouble for the flags that are flown outside of his summer home, I guess. At one point, flying an upside down flag, which was the symbol adopted by the sort of January 6th movement to overturn the 2020 election and place Donald Trump back in the White House, despite the fact that he lost the election. And another flag that is referred to as the Appeal to Heaven flag, which is a Christian nationalist flag. And the kind of subtext of the Appeal to Heaven is that they're kind of a higher court than democracy. If the people vote wrong, then you appeal to heaven, and they will place the God ordained ruler in power. He has blamed these flags on his wife. Apparently, he's not in charge of the flag placement at his home.
Well, now wait a minute. Now he even says at the store, it reportedly, he even asked her not to do it. Reportedly.
the it's it's a peculiar thing, I think, to be endorsing anti-democratic coups essentially, while your husband is the one of the 9 people who determine what the Constitution says for the entire country. It's yeah, but that is the background to this statement, and this shows that the Christian nationalist sentiments expressed in the flag are not very far from his considered views that he will tell to a stranger at a get together.
He seemed to be very free, and I thought that was interesting. Even when you are in those environments, and we've both been there, um, you don't know who you're talking to.
Yeah.
And so you are very, 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 very cautious. And now you have to be cautious with what you even say under your breath.
Yeah. Well, at the Supreme Court, this Supreme Court in particular, I would say probably Supreme Courts in general, but this particular set is very committed to the idea that they are the law. That no one they answer to no one but their own conscience, which is why they're able to some of them take millions of dollars worth of bribes, and just are assured in their own heart that this isn't going to affect how they're voting.
Well, hold on, because I want you to define for the audience, because the corporate media and even the progressive media call them gifts.
Yeah.
But you're saying, no, they're bribes. Why? What is a bribe? And so, because that would help us to understand why you define these gifts from these billionaires who have matters before the court that directly impact their businesses and philosophies. Let's be very clear.
Yeah.
The Koch brothers and on and on and on. Because indeed, we now see that Clarence Thomas has been on a speaking tour for these people, for heaven's sake.
Right. You don't take gifts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from your friends. That's not in our culture. One does not expect to be given when you get a wrap package on your birthday, you don't open it up and expect there to be a Fabergé egg worth $1 million in there. While Supreme Court justices are very well paid, they are not they're not billionaires. They are sort of ordinary upper middle class people. But that is not the lifestyle that either Alito or Clarence Thomas appears to aspire to. They want to live like the billionaires that benefit from their rulings.
And they want to keep company with them.
Yes. Yeah.
So what does that say about their philosophies, you think?
Well, one thing that among the many erosions of democracy that this Supreme Court has overseen is a definition of bribery, a legal definition of bribery that makes it almost impossible to prosecute bribery. They have issued rulings that basically say, unless you say, I'm giving you this money, and in return, I want you to vote a particular way on this bill that's going to come up, that is bribery. If you simply hand a legislator a sack full of money and then say, oh, not apropos of nothing, I'm very interested in this bill that's coming up, and I hope out of the goodness of your heart you'll vote against it. That is not bribery according to the Supreme Court, because people give money to politicians, and that just happens, and then people have opinions that they share with politicians, and if these things happen in parallel without any connection being made between the two of them, that's not bribery according to the Supreme Court, which is I think an absurd kind of way of looking at political corruption. because I don't think that bribery traditionally comes with a receipt that explains what you're buying with the suitcase full of money. But now the new standard is that you have to basically produce a receipt for the suitcase full of money in order to prosecute people for political corruption.
Is there a check on the Supreme Court? You have a check on the president.
Yeah.
You don't. I mean, because I'm trying to find, because they make their own ethics, they make their own rules, and they're responsible for investigating themselves. How is that supposed to work?
Yeah. Congress has some powers just given in the Constitution to set rules for the Supreme Court. One of the things that was not really spelled out in the Constitution was how those rules are meant to be enforced. The Supreme Court, the Congress does have the ability to impeach Supreme Court members for, high crimes and misdemeanors. I'm not sure if that's the exact phrase that is used in regards to the Supreme Court, but given the political situation where impeachment is always now a culture war stance, people vote for impeachment not on the basis of
principle, party.
Yeah. And unless you have a 2/3 majority in the Senate, which is probably impossible for either party to get, you're not going to impeach anyone.
Or should I say convict anyone?
Yeah, right.
You might be able to impeach, but I think we have to be clear with the audience that an impeachment is, look, we get it. We get mixed up all the time, and corporate media do not help because they should let us know that an impeachment is an indictment.
Right.
That's why you have to have a trial.
Right. It's a conviction that is impossible to get.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that the power that the Congress has that does not require a 2/3 majority is the power to expand the Supreme Court. Between Congress and the president, if they agree, because there's not the number 9 is not mentioned in the Supreme Court. It's up to Congress and the president to decide how many people are supposed to be on the Supreme Court. And I think that the public ought to recognize that there is corruption in the Supreme Court, that the majority of the Supreme Court is now representing that corruption, and that the only practical way to deal with that corruption is to expand the court, is to add enough new members to the court so that this corrupt majority no longer holds sway, and you can get rulings that are not based on corruption, and in the case of certain members of the court, far right ideology. I think that is the lesson to be drawn from comments like Alito's.
Well, let me ask you this, because they did. Because now it seems like the rules of engagement are changing, because now Mrs. Alito is part of the story, and there you have it. And she told this person, Lauren Windsor, no, he is not in charge of me. I'm in charge of me, which, hey, I'm not mad about that. But that having been said, let's look at Ms. Windsor for a minute, because I raised this question with you earlier. Because I'm trying to find out what the ethics are. And maybe that's one of the themes that's going to run through the show today. Ethics, and our own hypocrisies, because we've become so factionalized in terms of our party politics that we can't see right and wrong. And I want to know, I know it's fair game, but is it fair play for someone to misrepresent themselves and interview you and then release the audio? And I say that because I've been interviewed countless times, and members of my family, we've been in public life almost 60 years. So we've been interviewed, and um, when you're being interviewed, that you're being interviewed. And I remember watching, I used to love the Barbara Walters specials, and she interviewed Diana Ross. And what surprised Barbara Walters was that Diana Ross knew so much about her. She said, "Wait a minute, um, how did you know that about me?" She said, "You're here to interview me. Of course, I investigated you." I loved it. I was a kid. I was like, "Yeah, there you go." But I'm trying to find out was what she did. I appreciate the information, although, like I said, this Justice Alito mouthed basically called the president a liar on camera, and he knew that the cameras were trained on them. He knew that the likelihood was great that they'd be caught. Well, that you would zoom in because they were being filmed. That's the way it works.
Yeah.
So it was it ethical what she did?
Well, if you ask sort of the Congress of journalists this question, you would get a very different answer today than you would have gotten, say, 40 years ago. There is a long tradition of people going undercover to expose the wrongdoing that happens in private. People like Nellie Bly is a famous journalist who actually checked herself into an insane asylum in order to see what the treatment of the mentally ill was. And reforms happened because of what she found out. You're a Chicagoan. You may remember the Mirage Tavern.
Oh, yes.
Which was a tavern set up by the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper for the purpose of seeing how they would be treated by the many inspectors who come around to make sure that everything is on the up and up at an establishment with a liquor license. And they found, and not to anyone's surprise, that inspectors in Chicago in those days were very interested in receiving gifts, shall we say, from people who run businesses like the tavern. It did a great deal to expose what people in Chicago knew about, but is because it's happening behind closed doors. It's not really something that you can do anything about. But the corruption that happens on the local government level that affects small businesses, and these were considered, kind of important and sort of heroic reporting to do that kind of undercover work. And at a certain point, there was a decision made that this actually was not okay. And there was I think the courts had quite a bit of impact on the way that journalists view these things, because courts have ruled that in a case involving ABC going to a supermarket and documenting the really fairly disgusting treatment of meat and other products at a supermarket chain, that because the journalists had misrepresented themselves and had not been forthright about being journalists that wanted to get these jobs so they could expose what was happening, that the supermarket chain could actually sue them for misrepresenting themselves, which I think that we all have an interest in knowing that our food is safe.
Yeah.
And the handling of the food doesn't happen all in the public areas. A lot of it happens in areas where only employees are allowed to go. And if journalists cannot become employees, then to a great extent, we have no way of knowing how our food is being handled. We're kind of at the mercy of corporations who do not have public safety as their prime principle. They have making money as their prime principle. The Fair did a piece quite a few years back now about a reporter named Ken Silverstein, who was writing for Harper's, set up a phony letterhead and presented himself to various lobbying groups as a representative of sketchy countries that had problems with human rights abuses, and would the lobbying companies help out with the PR problems of these countries? And of course they were happy to, because that's what lobbying groups do. And he got quite a bit of information about what the ethics of lobbying organizations are. And by and large, he got nothing but criticism from his colleagues, who thought that the idea of lying for a story invalidated any value, any worthwhile
discoveries. Right.
Yeah. And so that is a common attitude now in journalistic circles, that it doesn't matter how important the information that you're getting out is, that nothing really justifies misrepresenting yourself in order to get a story. And I have to say that I disagree with that. I think there are times when it is important to get behind the scenes and see what's happening behind closed doors. And some doors do not open to journalists. Some doors only open to people who are
at the Historical Society.
Yeah.
Well, let me, in about a minute, can you wrap this up for us? Because I think I just have the feeling as ProPublica and Intercept and all these wonderful outlets are reporting more and more about the gifts/bribes that the Supreme Court justices are getting, and given the fact that they have a new set of ethics, that they're the arbiters of themselves.
Right.
Unbelievable. There is no other place in the world where that is so. In about a minute, help us to wrap this up. What should we be looking for going forward?
Well, I do think that we should be paying attention to the views of the people who are on the Supreme Court, both the views that they express in off-the-cuff situations like this, but also the views that they express in their rulings, certainly, and the statements they make in speeches. The Federalist Society, which is a right-wing group that basically is picking the judges that the United States has, both on the Supreme Court and in lower courts. What their philosophy is important to pay attention to. And the question is, what do we do with this information? And as I said, I think that really, if you come to the conclusion that there's something fundamentally wrong with the Supreme Court, there is no authority that can come in and realistically do anything about that corruption, about that anti-democratic ideology that is established as a supermajority on the Supreme Court. And really the only tool that remains is expanding the court. That is the one thing that can be done to change the makeup of this court, without having to wait, a generation or two for the majority that we have now to pass from history.
Well, to pass away into the other regions. I'll
Yes.
just put it that way.
It's trying to be
Well, I don't want
Like,
I don't want to be morbid, but that's kind of what we're waiting for.
yeah,
It's unfortunate, but that's and maybe term limits. I don't know, but something has to happen because so much of the quiet part is being broadcast out loud, and
yeah,
I would say that about everything today, and that is a good thing. But the question is, as you just said, as is such a profound point. What are we going to do with the information? What are we going to do with it? Jim Narakis, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, fair.org. They are our eyes and ears. They give some of the most brilliant analysis of what's happening just in independent media and corporate media. And some of the most brilliant interviews are conducted by Jim Narakis and, of course, Janine Jackson and so many others. And I just thank you for the work that you do because whenever I have questions about what's happening in journalism, I have to reach out to you and Janine Jackson.
thank you so much.
Blessings to you, everybody. You know what? And Jim, I've got to get you to Chicago because we have got this convention coming, and it is going to be really, really exciting. That is in Chicago. I don't know what they're going to do in Milwaukee, but I'm going to be watching that too, the Republican convention.
Yeah.
But many people are very, very concerned about this convention, the Democratic National Convention that is coming to Chicago. And I would even say, I hate to use the term fear. That's so strong. But certainly there's there's a whole lot of discussion about whether this will be a repeat of 1968. President Biden was in Chicago just a couple of weeks ago, and there were protests aplenty, but they kept them away from him. Well, that happened in Chicago come August. I mean, the fact is, you had a lot of people who have been applying for permits and they've been turned down. A lot of people, they're coming to Chicago. What is going to happen? Well, I tell you what, Professor Steven Zunes, I'm always so glad to be able to get him from the University of San Francisco, although that is not where he is right now. And I'm so glad that you're with us. I want to read from this fascinating piece I read in Common Dreams. Can Biden learn from 1968 before it's too late? And that is the question that many of us have in Chicago because we're wondering, just as Chicagoans, how am I going to be able to get around? I mean, because they're going to be shutting everything down. And indeed, the Rainbow Push International Conference, Professor Zunes, is going to be happening in the 4 days prior to the convention. August 13th through the 17th, the International Rainbow Push Conference will be happening. And then on the 18th, the Democratic Conference begins. So this is what you wrote. The year 1968 may be repeating itself. The United States is again experiencing an incumbent Democratic administration supporting an unpopular war, disruptive protests on college campuses, police repression against nonviolent demonstrators, a Republican challenger promising to restore law and order. I'm about to pass out here. To top it off, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. What lessons, why are you musing aloud as to whether President Biden has learned these lessons or not? I mean, help me to understand because just the opening paragraph for me this morning was like, that is why people who lived through that chaotic period, and it was unsettling in Chicago. I mean, of course, I don't remember it, but they all said, we're walking into this again, and we need to really, really watch it because it's not the same world that it was in 1968. Dr. Steven Zunes, welcome back to the show. Oh, you're muted. Okay, let me see. Okay.
How about
there
now?
you go.
Okay,
Hey.
great. Great to be back, Santita.
Always.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah, this it's quite striking the way that Biden seems to be so oblivious to the amount of discontent in the United States about his war on Gaza. I mean, it's not just disagreement on a foreign policy issue. I mean, it's a really deep kind of moral issue, and it's not simply the pro-Palestinian crowd, the anti-Zionist crowd, the people who have long had issues with Israel and the occupation and Zionism as a whole. But basic international law, I mean, we have an incumbent administration that is attacking the International Criminal Court, that these 5 outstanding jurists, who are, well respected, who worked in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Sudan. I mean, these are just a top international jurists and human rights lawyers that say both Israel and Hamas have been committing these war crimes and have all this evidence. And Joe Biden, who is in the bottom 10th of his class at Syracuse Law School, says, no, you guys don't know what you're talking about. This is outrageous. And
not the bottom 10th.
Yes, he was in the bottom 10th of his high school, of his law school class at Syracuse University. But then you have 40-something Democrats in the House joining the Republicans, putting sanctions on people in the International Criminal Court, including Amal Clooney, George Clooney's wife. And this is the same George Clooney who's doing this big fundraiser for Biden out in Los Angeles in a couple of weeks. Meanwhile, you have attacking against UN organizations, against Amnesty International. I mean, in other words, Biden and the Democratic leadership is going against some of the very, very principles of liberal internationalism. I mean, I grew up with a liberal Democratic family, who believed in world federalism, who admired Eleanor Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson, and all the Democrats who helped build the foundations of international humanitarian law. And we now have an administration that is trashing these things. And top it off, we have Hakeem Jeffries, the chief Democrat in the House, and Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, the chief Democrat in the Senate, inviting a soon-to-be indicted war criminal to address a joint session of Congress, which is a high honor that's not been given to many world leaders historically. This is the 4th time they're inviting him. The last time he was there, he ended up trashing Barack Obama with this really vicious and misleading attack, and they're inviting him to come back again. And
they let him back even before he got here. He was trashing the president.
Exactly.
Right.
And I'm here. I'm as you know, I'm living here in Europe for about half of this year, and the Europeans, I mean, are aghast. I mean, they would almost every country in Europe, once the formal indictment comes down, which could be any day now, they would be legally required to arrest Netanyahu if he set foot on their soil. But meanwhile, the United States.
I know. I need you to explain, because many of us. We have a very our perspective is just shaped by what we see here. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing like many, and I've lived overseas, and Time magazine has a German edition. Mm-hmm. They have a UK edition. Many of us don't know that. Unless you've been over there, you wouldn't know. Mm-hmm. And they say things and they print things in the Japanese Time magazine that they wouldn't dare. I mean, my eyes popped like, I can't believe you said this, because they would talk about Middle East policy 30, 40 years ago. And they would say things that you, at least at that time, daren't say over here. Mm-hmm. So what is, before you continue, what is the reaction?
Well, I mean, they're pretty horrified. I mean, again, these countries are not anti-Israel. They recognize Israel. They support Israel's right to exist. They support Israel's right to self-defense. But they recognize that Israel's committing serious war crimes. And the United States, is practically alone in continuing to defend Israel in terms of what it's doing. And the thing is, it's not just on Israel. I mean, look, I was actually traveling in Europe. I was just for a few weeks. I wasn't living there back then. Back when it was revealed that the United States was mining Nicaraguan harbors and blowing up their oil installations, arming the Contras. It went before the International Court of Justice, and a unanimous decision, say for the American judge, who dissented largely on technicality, said this was illegal. Went to the UN Security Council. The United States cast the only negative vote, vetoing it. And again, the reaction in Europe was amazing. Within 3 days of the revelations, you had 30,000 people demonstrating in the streets of Amsterdam, and you had Adolfo Perez Esquivel, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Argentina, the liberation theology guy, he spoke at this big rally, and similar on Vietnam, Iraq. The United States is very much an international outlier. That's generally been under Republican administrations. This time it's under a Democratic administration, and with the support of the Democratic leadership in Congress. And getting back to your original question about Chicago, that's why there are going to be huge protests there. This is, again, not just the hardcore pro-Palestinian crowd. This is old-time liberals who believe in the Democratic Party of Adlai Stevenson and Eleanor Roosevelt, and the folks who really believe in international law and the United Nations, and that no country, regardless of its relations to the United States, are all bound by international law. And this resolution that's coming down to sanction anybody related to the International Criminal Court says specifically, if you indict anybody who is from a country allied with the United States. In other words, they don't say, if they indicted, Putin, hey, no problem. The fact that until they indicted those Russians just about a year and a half ago, all 54 indictments by the International Criminal Court were against Africans. These various warlords and some of these really terrible genocidal leaders like al-Bashir in Sudan, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Charles Taylor in Liberia. These guys deserved it. But the bias was not against the West. The bias was on Africa. And then finally, they did some non-Africans. But that was okay because they were Russians. For the first time ever, of the up to 59 indictments, they're finally doing it to two pro-Western leaders. That is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Gallant. And then they're freaking out that the ICC is totally biased. And the very fact that they explicitly say we'll sanction it only if you do it against people who are allied with us, they're saying we don't care what the evidence is. We don't care what the law is. What you care about is that the law should only apply to people from governments and movements we don't like. And so what happens to the rule of law? They're saying we don't believe in the rule of law. The law should, these are like the Trump people, saying the law should never apply to our people, only apply to the other people.
Then what is this blind spot with President Biden? Because it's almost as if he is snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Many people say, done a lot of things that.
Yeah, his domestic policy has been surprisingly good. He's been on domestic policy. He's been the most progressive, president since Lyndon Johnson. But like Lyndon Johnson, he is blowing it on the foreign policy.
And it's counter to everything, his entire record. This is the Joe Biden who's president domestically is a guy I don't recognize.
Exactly. When your father was running for president, I remember him being interviewed about what portraits he would have in the Oval Office if he became president. What former presidents would he have? And he mentioned Lincoln. I think he mentioned Roosevelt, and he mentioned Lyndon Johnson. And that was controversial for a lot of us, because we think, Johnson, we think Vietnam. But of course, your father talked about the Great Society, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, open housing. That Johnson indeed was a very progressive president on domestic issues. But again, he blew that legacy for many of us because of Vietnam. And similarly, Biden is destroying his legacy by supporting this genocidal war, and it's having a huge impact politically. And this is the main thrust of my article. It was not just the protests that are going to be in Chicago, which of course are going to be an issue, especially for those of you in Chicago, but that 83%. Let me run out a few statistics. 83% of Democrats support a permanent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, and the administration is up till now. This current ceasefire negotiations is kind of vague. It's talking maybe only in terms of part-time one, temporary one. 56% of Democrats say that Israel's committing genocide, only 22% believing otherwise. But of course, Biden says it's nonsense that genocide is going on. 3 times as many Democrats say Israel's gone too far and its military's actions are not justified than those who don't. And whereas Biden says they're completely justified. 62% of registered Democrats support suspending military aid to Israel. But the Biden administration, all but 3 Democratic senators and all but 40 House Democrats, approved $18 billion in additional unconditional aid just a couple months ago. And what is striking is that the key constituencies, Arab Americans, 60% of Arab Americans supported Biden in 2020, while only a third supported Donald Trump. This year, a poll shows that Arab American voters in key swing states, his support has dropped to only 20%. It's also dropped among Blacks. It's dropped among Hispanics. It's really dropped among the country's diverse base of 2.5 million Muslim voters, 86% of whom supported Biden in 2020. Now that's dropped to 36%. Young voters, that's the key. That's the key indicator, because when youth vote is high, Democrats win. When it's low, they lose, because young 18 to 30-year-olds usually vote 62%, roughly, for Democrats. That's what they supported with Biden. But nearly 3/4 of voters under the age of 30 oppose Biden's policy in Gaza. That's a higher percentage than opposed George W. Bush on Iraq, higher percentage than opposed Ronald Reagan in Central America, and even a higher percentage than opposed Richard Nixon on Vietnam. And and Biden has also been, because of the protests, he's been dissing these protesters. 97% of campus protests have been completely nonviolent, but he's acting like these are violent and disruptive, and he's blaming them for canceling graduation and classes, when in fact it's the administrations have done that. Talking about vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows. And even the young Democrats, the college Democrats, the official Democratic Party organization, they've come out against the war. They're supporting the protests. So
they're a very mainstream conservative group. They're very establishment, right?
Oh yeah. Speaking of establishment, the NAACP, which rarely talks about foreign policy, which is very close to the Democratic Party establishment. They've come out against the Gaza war. They have called for suspending U.S. military aid to Israel, which again Biden completely rejects. So he is really, really isolating himself. And I think he's just thinking that Donald Trump, the possibility of electing Donald Trump, is so scary that everybody's going to be willing to put this aside and go out and vote for him the same high numbers they did back in 2020. And I'd be the last person to discourage somebody in a swing state to not vote for Biden. We really do need to stop Trump. So I'm not approving this, but I'm just saying, as a political scientist, I can tell you that the voter turnout is going to be low. I mean, you're going to have all these key constituencies, minorities, young people, etc., who are they're not going to vote for Trump, but they're going to vote for Cornel West or the Green Party or whatever, or they won't leave the presidential line blank, or even if they do vote, they're not going to send money. They're not going to do the door-to-door canvassing. We need that army of young volunteers, to get people out to vote. It's going to impact the election, and it's going to impact it big.
Dr. Zunas, I've got about 3 minutes left here, and I've got to have you come back, because I really need you and I just need you to be with me for a whole segment, a whole hour. I need you to unpack what you see as a political scientist, because you are not an adherent. It's what goes into the equation. What's on the other side of equal sign is what I come up with is what I come up with. Because when you talk to people in the Democratic establishment, they are disbelieving everybody except, say, James Carville, that Black men, for example, won't vote for Trump. I'm telling you, they will. The Latinos, they will. The young people might not vote for Trump, but they're not going to vote for him, at least in this snapshot in time. And just as you laid out in 1968, what can we do? I mean, what?
Yeah, I think the thing is we have to change Biden's policy on Gaza. And the thing is here's it shows that there's a survey that showed that support for the Gaza war will make some voters in swing states, Democratic leaning voters, will make them 20% less likely to vote Democratic. But the flip side of that is if Biden suspends military aid to Israel and forces them into a ceasefire, the likelihood of voting for him increases by 40%. And this is big, because what's weird right now, and then just talk that there's this, the United States put together this ceasefire proposal. It's not a bad one. I mean, it's better than what they've done before, and it has potential of being a permanent one, not just a temporary one they've been talking about, where Hamas would free the hostage and then Israel could resume bombing and whatever. It's actually getting pretty close, and it passed the UN Security Council resolution. And Hamas has been saying positive things about it. The Israelis have been saying kind of negative things about it. So Israelis haven't formally rejected it. Hamas hasn't formally accepted it. But, Hamas seems a lot closer to accepting it than Israel. And yet Biden and Blinken are saying it's all in Hamas's court. Hamas is not, it's claiming Hamas is the one that's not accepting of it. But if you read what Hamas says, if you read what Israel says, it's not what Biden and Blinken are saying. This is what we've seen for years, that is always the Palestinians' fault. And this is not just with Hamas. Back with the PLO, the Palestine Authority, they've been much closer to the U.S. proposals than Israel has, and yet we always end up blaming the Palestinians, and we're seeing it again. But the fact is that, if this ceasefire proposal does get into effect, and if the United States is willing to pressure Israel by withholding arms to actually withdraw from Gaza and stop the bombing, this could turn things around, and this could, it's done a lot of damage. A lot of people are so mad at Biden, it's too late. But I think it might get enough people to turn around and actually support Biden, and we can head off the nightmare of a second Trump presidency.
Well, I tell you what, go to Common Dreams. I've linked it. Can Biden learn from 1968 before it's too late? If he listens to Professor Stevens Eunice, yes, he can turn things around. He can. But will he? That's the question. And why won't he? That's the next question for you when you come back to the show.
Yes.
Because we need to unpack why he's so intransigent.
Important questions, and I have some ideas. I don't know the answer, but I have some ideas, and
you're going to get a text from me because I think we have to follow that up because we're 2 months out.
Yeah,
I mean it's here, and you see the FBI, you see the Secret Service, you see the Chicago Police Department, the National Guard. Everybody is running around. In the meantime, these young people and Americans are planning in secret. They're not even talking to the corporate media. They won't talk to them. They're like, no, we'll just show up. Be sure we're going to do that. Wow. Jim Lawson, who we dedicate the show to today, as we did yesterday, Dr. King's mentor, someone who lived in India for 3 years. Yes, he did miss Gandhi, but he didn't miss the people who worked with Gandhi.
And Santita, can I mention something real briefly?
Yes, please.
I worked for Jim Lawson for quite a few years.
Okay,
I was one of the organizers of the James Lawson Institute that met every year in Nashville and sometimes elsewhere, training young activists. One thing about Jim that was just so important. I mean, not only was he a great moral figure, he was one of the smartest strategic thinkers out there, because he knew being right wasn't enough. You needed to think strategically. And he's known, of course, as a civil rights icon, from the struggle, but he also is a great ally to feminists and LGBTQ people, really spoke out in environmental issues, on immigrants' rights, very much on war and peace and foreign policy. He was out there, as well as fighting against what he called plantation capitalism. He saw the big picture, and he is one of the greatest figures of our time. I'm really mourning his loss, and it was one of the greatest honors that I was able to work with him for so many years.
And thanking God for all that he left behind, because he literally taught us how to demonstrate.
Yes, as he said about Gandhi, his greatest works are yet to come.
Absolutely. Professor Stevens Eunice, thank you so much. Thank you so much. But that's going to be the next question I ask for you. Why won't Biden move?
Yes.
So in the next couple of days, you'll be hearing from me, because I think you need to answer that. Why won't he move? Why? I mean, Blinken. Just who are these people? Who are they, and what are they doing? I'm like, what are you doing? Because now, when he goes to Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian minister had him waiting all night long.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the ultimate disrespect.
Yeah.
You all have to understand what's going on here. And blessings to you and my love to your wife. And thank you for always joining us. But you're going to hear from me in the next 24 hours because that's the next question we need to ask. Why?
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, on the what? Blessings to you. Everybody, let's talk about Hunter Biden and what this means, you know, for he's been viewed with a great deal of sympathy, and he should, because there are a lot of traumatized people who are struggling with addiction and who are struggling. But the kind of sympathy and empathy that we give to him and his family, can't we give that to everybody else's? Think about that, everybody. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show.